Okay, so sure. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to this talk. It's a pleasure for us, especially for me, because I consider you a friend. So I will give you now the microphone for you, so you can do a brief introduction about your work. And we are looking for hearing your talk. And during your talk, if you need something, just actually talk, and then I will help you. Okay?
Okay. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for inviting me to do this talk, actually. It's really nice to be able to talk to an international audience from the comfort of, well, not my own home, but usually my friend's home, who I'm staying with here in Chicago now, to reach such an international audience. So I want to talk today about gait stability. What is it, and how can we measure it, and how are we sure that we're measuring what we are measuring? So I'm currently working at the VU University, as you can see on the slides, Move Research Institute, and I'm being funded by the NWO. Before I start this talk, I should acknowledge the help of some people who have contributed to these ideas in some way or another, and without whom this work would not be what it is. So you can see those names on these slides here. They're in totally random order, and I probably forgot a whole bunch of people. But these people are of great importance for this work, so I just want to thank them for everything they contributed. Okay, so switching to the topic of today, I want to start you off with a riddle. And some of you may know this riddle because it's a quite ancient riddle. It's the riddle asked to Oedipus by the Sphinx, and it's: what animal walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 by nightfall? Is there anybody with an answer here? Yes, yes, I see. No. Okay. So the answer is, of course, man. For in the morning, we cannot walk on 2 legs yet. Oh, in the morning we cannot walk on 2 legs yet. It's too complicated. Only during full day we're able to walk on 2 legs, and then as we grow older, we need a walking aid, a cane, or a rolling device. So this nicely illustrates how complex walking on 2 legs is, and how complex it is to stay stable and not fall over. And falling over when you're younger is not such a problem for the toddler, because they probably will not break anything or so. But for the elderly, we all know that the consequences of falling might be tremendous. And, well, basically we want to reduce that, but in order to reduce the falls, we need to first understand, okay, what is gait stability? So by giving this talk, I basically have 4 goals, and I hope Brazil will score 4 goals as well in a match right after this talk. So the first goal is to convince you that in order to know something about stability, we need perturbations. The second goal is to show you that I think that there are at least 4 aspects that define gait stability, so that you can't do it with just one thing. And the third is to show you how you can potentially validate new measures of gait stability, because gait stability is such a hard concept. I think that you need to be very careful with what measures you're using and how you're using them and why you're using them. So I want to talk a bit about that. And the last goal is to show you some measures of gait stability to give an idea about all that. You can see the reference down there in the slide. Share your camera. Can everybody see me or not? You cannot see me?
Hey, Sjoerd. Probably there's a
Yeah.
put your cursor on the URL webcam. It'd be a button like compartilhar, to mean share, so it should work.
Initiar computer.
Okay.
So I'm visible now?
Yeah. Great.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Sorry for that. So Okay, so you can see the reference on the bottom of the slide there. Actually, most of the ideas that I will be talking about today are present in that review on Gait Stability, which I wrote together with my former PhD advisors. So if you're interested in any of it and want to look it up later on, not all slides have references, some do, but if you want to look at some of the ideas, the chance that you will find it in this paper is very high, and otherwise you can just shoot me an email. Okay, so let's start off with the first goal, to convince you that in order to say something about stability we need perturbations. So I'm going to ask you a question. Which one of these two balls is in a more stable position? Is it left or is it right? Anybody? This is hard, huh? I don't see any answers coming. Look the same, yeah. Actually, this is what we look at when we look at a human. We don't know, because we do not see the whole system. We just maybe see the behavior. When we would see the whole system, oh, this goes too quick. Why do all my builds go at once? Okay, when we see the whole system, we would see that the left one is stable and the right one is unstable, right? But we cannot observe the whole system, so we don't actually know. So what would be an option to do if we cannot observe in what landscape these balls are, is of course to give them a perturbation. And then the one on the left would go back. Can you still hear me? Okay. Okay, so the one on the right is unstable, and you can see that if you give a perturbation, right? Stability cannot be assessed without perturbations. So without perturbations, we can never know the full system. But even when we get perturbations, what should we look at? What measure should we use? And how do we look at gait stability? We all probably know some studies, for instance, of mare and pineapples, where they trip subjects, which would be a good idea, but is that everything? Well, in the next slides I will argue, and this is already my second goal, so I'm scoring the goals quickly, that we should look at 4 things actually, not just one. One is not enough, we need 4. Okay, so if we start off very simple, and this is the first movie, and if all is correct, I think Felipe will post you a link to the movie right now. If we simplify walking to the simplest thing we can imagine, we end up with what is called a dynamic walker. This is basically a toy of walking which consists of 2 rigid sticks which are connected at the hip by a hinge joint, frictionless. And this kind of toy can walk down a slope without any extra needed control. It can even have some small perturbations, so the slope can be a bit bumpy, and it will just, keep on walking. There's no control needed for that. It's stable simply because of the mechanics it has. It is stable because it has some mass, it is stable because it has a certain swing time, and it's walking on a certain slope. So each time it's put its foot down, some energy is lost, and that is transferred into forward energy. Some energy is transferred into forward energy again, and you get the next step. So if we look at walking like this, I think that there is a case where walking is like this. It's what we do in our laboratories actually most of the time when we are on a treadmill. We're looking at each step is almost the same. Nothing has to happen. Almost nothing has to happen because there will always be very small perturbations, right? Because our nervous system isn't perfect, so there will be some noise in the contractions of your muscles, and not every step will be the same. Did everybody have the time to see the movie by now? I see one yes. Okay. I see some people typing and I see a lot of yeses. Okay, very good. So then we continue to the next slide where we make it a bit more complex, because this was just walking on a treadmill, flat ground. And of course, gait isn't that easy. When we're walking, we're constantly being perturbed by larger perturbations. For instance, I'm now in Chicago, a very busy city. In Holland, this wouldn't happen so much, but here I get run into by people a lot. So I get bumped into, and if I have that, if my simple model, if I would make this model, this simple robot, it could not handle that. So we need something to control those larger perturbations and put us back into this repeatable gait pattern. So a somewhat complexer reactive gait stability, for instance, for tripping or slipping, to get us back to this pattern which was repeatable and stable, actually almost by itself. And if you look at the movie, Felipe posted just now, you can see one of the examples that we have used. This is actually Professor van Dieren, my then promoter. You can see him getting perturbed by, for instance, one of the setups which you could use to assess gait stability in that way. And what kind of measures you'd use for that, I'll talk about later. That's my fourth goal, of course, as I said. But here you can see that clearly he is doing something different. So he's walking normally, it's not costing too much of an effort, and then he gets this perturbation and he has to really step out and do something different from his normal gait pattern. Okay. Did everybody have the chance to see the movie? Okay, very good. Okay, I see a lot of yeses, that's clear. Okay, so then the next slide, this is all nice and everything, but we can also get to a perturbation where maybe our system is able to handle it, and we could, but because we have, for instance, a splint, or our muscles are not strong enough, we cannot put our foot forward far enough. So then we basically reach the limits of what we can do with this reactive perturbation. And you can see this in the next movie. I think this is a nice example where you can see that the penguin clearly, it appears he has a quick enough reaction, but because his legs are so short, he just topples over. So there's basically an upper limit to what you can do with this reactive gait stability, which doesn't necessarily have to be defined by how well you are at reacting, but it may be defined by your anatomical constraints as well. There's very dramatic music also for the movie. So, yeah, poor guy indeed. Okay, so well, that's three aspects of gait stability, and the fourth one is something I think most of you may have happened to yourself, and I had it the other day again. And it happens more and more, I think, in modern day society, where everybody's just texting while they're walking. We walk down a curb every day, right? You step down it and there's no problem. Okay, so you probably had the same situation where you stepped down the curb, but you were texting and you didn't notice that the end of the curb was coming up. I think that's different from when you look ahead and actually see it, and there's the next movie coming up here. So I think that the planned kind of perturbation, or obstacle avoidance as it's called in a movie, is very different from the reactive kind of perturbation and stability kind of reaction you get. So I think that we also need to make a separate category for that and see how well people are at that. Because what I'm saying here with these four things is that, okay, you can be very stable for your steady state gait, but does it actually matter? Because you're not going to be in your steady state gait all the time. Maybe you're going to need a reactive response, and if your reactive response is not good enough, you're going to fall anyway. But then again, if you're not very stable in your steady state gait, you may need your reactive responses very often. And if you need your reactive responses very often, the chance that it will fail one time is of course present. So what I'm saying here is, I think you need at least 4 different things to be good in a certain way in order to have a stable gait and not fall, right? And one of those things is as it's called here, obstacle avoidance. I would opt for the term proactive gait stability, where you proactively, in a kind of adaptive fashion, plan what's coming up ahead of you, and not react to that, because reaction would be that you let it happen and then react to it, but you make a motor plan ahead and in that fashion adapt to it, actually. So going over that once again, okay, the slide is coming up a bit too quick. The idea was, I think that we need steady state gait stability in order to have some gait that is stable by itself, and for which we don't need to do so much. But of course that's not enough, because you're going to get perturbations. And okay, they pop up again, I'm just leaving it there. So you need both the proactive and the reactive gait stability as well. And of course your maximum perturbation you can handle should be large enough, because if you cannot handle a very large perturbation, you're going to fall anyway. Right. If your legs are very short, as is the penguin, then with a small step down, you will fall down. So is this idea clear to everybody? Because I cannot see the audience. Normally this is where I look at people's faces and go like, okay, I should explain a bit more. Are there questions here? Or does somebody not like the idea or like the idea? Not yet. Okay. Well, that's good. If you have questions, please shoot anytime, because it's, I'd rather have it. Please list the 4 specifically. So the one is steady state gait stability. That's just walking along normally. Then you have the proactive gait stability, which is planning for an upcoming perturbation. For instance, when you walk down the pavement and you see the curb coming up and you plan to step on it or step off it. Then you have reactive gait stability, that you didn't plan it, but you all of a sudden step down and then you have to recover. And then there's the largest perturbation you can handle. So that's how large can it be before you're going to fall down. Okay. That's the list of all 4. I would like to point out that the proactive gait stability, I think, is not in the review I just mentioned, because at that time, well, I think we didn't think about it, maybe one of the reasons, and also because we didn't want to complicate things any further. So in the review we focus on steady state gait stability, reactive gait stability, and the maximum perturbation you can handle. Okay. Aren't the values for maximum perturbation size different for proactive and reactive gait stability? Yes, that could very well be, in which would actually make it 5 different things. Although, as far as I know, there's very little research into looking for these different aspects in the same subject. So I wouldn't, theoretically I agree that they could be very different. I don't know of any research that actually shows it. So, okay, so I think we continue here. I'm just going to wait because it seems somebody is asking another question. Okay, not. Okay. So this is actually my second goal. I hope to have scored by now for Brazil. So let's move on. So we have a measure. We concluded that we need 4 different kinds of measures, but which one should we use? which measure should we use for each of these different types of stability. And if we are creative and we come up with some new measure, or for instance, say we want to quantify reactive perturbations or the steady-state gait stability, how do we know it makes sense? Because everybody can come up with something, and you maybe have some friends in the mathematics department and they tell you, wow, we have this fancy mathematic method which you definitely should use, right? So how do you know it makes sense? And this part of the talk is actually not only applicable to gait stability, I think, but to, well, many measures in general, not only in gait, in everything. Although it's more specific for gait. Okay. So if you're going to look at how can I test that my measure is actually doing what it's doing, then step one is, of course, well, why should your measure work? Why should your measure actually measure gait stability or reactive gait stability or steady-state gait stability? This sounds obvious, but if a measure doesn't measure something we think it should, then maybe you should not use it. And you see this happening. So it's good to think about, okay, what do I think this measure actually represents, and does this represent what I want to know? Yeah, so for instance, there's no reason to believe the color of your eyes is predictive of your gait speed. But this is a really bad example, of course, because we all can see this, but you see sometimes measures for mostly the quite complex mathematical measures, and then people refer to it as measure of gait stability, whereas it's simply, I don't know, say, I'm just gonna say something now, it's simply how much power is in your power spectrum or something. And if you have no reason to believe that that is related to gait stability, then why would you use it as a measure of gait stability? So before starting to use a measure or a method as a matter of gait stability, you should have a good idea as to why should this measure gait stability. It's so basic, but still I think people often overlook it, and that's why I want to point it out explicitly. And otherwise, we might as well just use hair length as a measure of gait stability. So once again, this is totally ridiculous to use hair length, but it's to show you that if you're going to use a certain measure to measure something, sit down and think about what does the measure represent, and why do you think that is related to gait stability. Take some time to do that. It's very important. So then the second step is, does it actually work in a simple model? Because if theoretically it worked, then it should work in a simple case. If it does not work in a simple case, then why should it work for more complex cases, right? If I make a measure and it's a beautiful mathematical measure and everybody can see that it's should describe stability, but if I try it in a simple model and it does not give me the results I expect, then why should I believe that it works for more complex cases? Actually, I have no reason to believe, so I wouldn't use it. So, of course, what is a simple case stays the question. I've done some work using this simple compass model, for which you can quite easily calculate the actual stability. So what you can do with these kind of models is change something about their geometry. You can, for instance, change, I should be able to point, wait. Yeah, you can, for instance, change the arc of the foot here, or you can change the mass, or you can change the length of the legs. And if you change those, the stability of the model will change. Well, how do you know the stability of the model will change if you only have your measure of stability, you're asking me? Well, what you can do is with this model, you can actually make it walk on a bumpy slope, so that each step is slightly different from the next. So it's walking on a rough road, and as you increase the roughness of the road, at some point it will start to fall down. And you can see, okay, how rough can the road be? before this model falls down. And then you calculate your measure for a certain leg length, you calculate how rough can the road be before it falls down, and you do that for different leg lengths. And then if your measure really does express gait stability, then it should be correlated to how rough can the road be before the model falls down. And this should already give you an impression. And if it does not work in such a simple case, then of course you can have your doubts whether it will work in a more complex case. Because why would it work in a more complex case if it doesn't in a simple case? It would be hard. You can of course do this for such a simple model you can only use for the steady state gait stability, but you can think of more complex models where you add some kind of controller, and you can look at the reactive gait stability in a similar fashion. Okay, so now we know it works theoretically, and we know it works in a simple model. What would be the next step? Well, the next step would be, of course, does it work in a more complex model? Does it work in a human? Let's get this one away. Okay. It's an easy enough question, but it's actually what we want to know, right? Does it work in a human? But to do this, you need to destabilize your subjects, right? Because what you want is one subject with stable, and then test this and calculate your measure, and then have them unstable and calculate your measure. Because if you're going to test people who you think are unstable and people you think are stable, then there's already the assumption that one group is unstable and the other group is stable. And you don't want to rely on assumptions. So the question for you here, how would you test it? How would you destabilize your subjects? Anybody? I see somebody typing. Toddlers are naturally unstable. They could be tested. Blindfold. Well, if you're going to test toddlers, then you're testing two groups against each other again, and you have the assumption that the toddlers are unstable, but you don't know. The blindfold, I quite like the idea, because with the blindfold you take one source of sensory information away, and because you have less sensory information, you can say that the processing should be less well, so stability should be a problem. I see one more, two more. I think move the floor, step in a softer floor. It's also a good plan, get a soft floor, soft surface. I think you're all, well, most of you in Brazil will destabilize yourself not so long after my talk, during your match. Alcohol would, of course, be a very good way to do it. We know that with alcohol, most of us walk less stable. Of course, that can be a problem if you have ethical committees, etc. So another way to do it would be to use galvanic vestibular stimulation. No, it's not permanent now. And galvanic vestibular stimulation is actually a stimulation of the I can't find a word for this. The sensory systems, your inner ears actually. So your vestibular systems basically get the wrong information, and it's kind of like blindfolding except for your vestibular system. And if you look at the movie, this is some Japanese guys that took this really far, and they actually use this to control this woman. And their idea, I think, is to use it in gaming to give you the impression that you're really inside the game. But you could also use this, of course, and we have done, as I will show later on a treadmill. To impair gait stability in healthy humans. Okay. So now we know it works in theory. We know it works in. How's he doing that? So what he's doing is he's having a remote control, and there is when he's moving a remote control, there's a current going through the device that's behind her ears, and the current moves from either from left to right, from right to left, and it runs through the opolits, which give you the sense that you're heading in one direction. Electrical current, yes, it's galvanic vestibular stimulation. Yeah. Okay, so we know it works in theory, or we tested it works in theory. Well, we made clear it works in theory. We showed it in a simple model, and we showed it in an experiment with healthy humans. So the next step would, of course, be to see if it's actually correlated to falling. And this makes only sense if we know that for the first 3 steps, we found positive results. So that we found that indeed it theoretically it makes sense, it works in a model, and in an experimental study we found that you could show decreased instability with it. And then we can do large-scale studies in which we measure a whole bunch of elderly and see how often they fall and see how that correlates to these measures that you proposed. So my colleagues in Amsterdam, Sietse Rispens and Kim van Schoten, they did a study where they collected data on by now 450 elderly. I think they have published on about 150 so far, and calculated several measures of gait stability from a week of accelerometer data. So the subjects were in accelerometer for a week and correlated that to how often people fell. And this kind of studies will give you insight if you know the first 3 steps. And this is the 4th step that will say, okay, this is really something about gait stability, about falling gait stability. Okay. So this is actually my 3rd goal, and good time to pause actually. Oh, wait, this is to sum it up, kind of. So it seems like a long road to test for one measure if you actually should be using it, and it is. But like walking the mountains, I think that taking shortcuts may lead to even longer walks. I mean, you might just end up in front of a river which you can cross. So it's good to just take the long road and be safe and know that you're measuring what you measure. But luckily for a lot of measures, a lot of these steps have been taken already, and this is also in the review we wrote. We have an overview of this, and some of the steps can actually be taken quite easy. For instance, the modeling work, if you have somebody in your lab who is good with models, it doesn't have to take too much time to just test that. So, and also if you have a database with a lot of data from fallers and non-fallers, the 4th step is also not, it doesn't have to be so hard. Okay. So moving on to goal number 4, but quick break here to see if there's any questions so far. I don't see any appearing. Oh, wait a bit. No. Okay. Not here, thanks. Okay, so then we'll move on. So now I want to talk about some gait stability measures, and I've just selected 3 because I could talk for hours, and yeah, we have only 45 minutes and we're already nearing that. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the maximum Lyapunov exponent, I think, because it's a quite popular measure. A lot of people are using it, and also I was convinced at the start of my PhD that this measure could not work and should not work, and actually I've tried to prove that ever since and failed miserably every time. So I think this measure really says something. So the maximum Lyapunov exponent comes from the idea that the small variations in gait can be regarded as small perturbations. In which case it would be interesting to see what happens to the small perturbations over time, and that's exactly what Lyapunov exponents do. And I should also mention that I have a solid background in mathematics and physics, where you can really see that they quantify the stability of a system. What led me to believe that they shouldn't work? Well, it's such an abstract measure that seems so far off from reality that I thought it was just a mathematical trick. And that's why I thought, well, it doesn't work. Theoretically, it seems logic that it works, but then again, it's so far off from reality, it seems that it would be hard. Okay, so I'm not going to go to the calculations in detail. I'm going to explain what maximum Lyapunov exponents actually measure. So, say we measured something like the 3D accelerations of a person walking, and you can imagine that it looks somewhat like this plot you're seeing here, right? So this is, for instance, this is the y-axis, this is the x-axis, and this is the z-axis, right? So we can see something like that, and let's see if I can. Okay, this is going too quick. Yep. Okay, so this is just a zoom in of that portion. So this is what we measured, and this is a zoom in of that portion. So if you look at the star here, you see that there's a lot of trajectories close together, and we said, okay, we're going to see that one trajectory is a perturbation, a small perturbation of the other. So let's do that. So and see what happens over time. Of course, is this plot of the acceleration of the same segment? It's an example plot of, for instance, the acceleration of the trunk, which is you mostly use, and the plot on the right is just a zoom in of the plot on the left. So we start off with the star there and regard one trajectory as a perturbation of the other. Of course, if it's a stable system, then if we have one trajectory is going like that and one like that, like this, then if I bump one out a bit and it's stable, then they should go together, right? Because it's stable, so that they both want to go the same way. As with the ball, if I bump the ball a bit, it comes back to the same position. If they're unstable, what should happen is it goes like this. Okay. So what you do is you measure those distances, what happens to those distances over time, and you say, okay, actually I'm not interested so much in the distances as I am in do the distances grow or shrink, so you're interested in the slope of those distances. You do that not for one point, but you do that for all your data points you have here. You look for the nearest neighbor and you're going to look, okay, how does this grow over time? You take the mean over that, and then what you get is a curve that looks something like this. So this is time in stride on the x-axis, and this is the log of the divergence. So the log of the distance between those points. So initially at 0, they're very close because we selected them to be very close. We looked for the closest point, and then they grow. And we said that the rate of growth tells us something about stability. So this slope here tells us something about stability. If the slope is smaller than 0, we have a stable system. If it's larger than 0, we have an unstable system. This is the mathematical thing. The natural log of the measured divergence. It's actually the slope of the natural log of divergence with respect to time. So it's about the slope here. So if the slope is steeper, we're less stable. Okay. Can everybody hear me again? Yep, I guess so, because everybody's typing. Okay. So it's this slope you're looking at. For some reasons which I won't go into in detail, although we know that we can walk stably, this slope is always positive in humans, but the idea is the higher the slope, the less stable you are. So, how to choose the correct epochs in the plot to calculate long and short coefficients? That's a very good question. What is usually done is to calculate it from 0 to half a stride, and for that is also the most evidence that it's actually correlated to gait stability. And it seems to make sense, because what you do after that is basically, if you have perturbation, you should recover with, you should be able to, most of the perturbations recover within one step, and that's half a stride. So that's why you look at half a stride, and for that there's also the most evidence. Although if you look at the mathematical, the pure mathematical description, you should actually be looking at a slope where the slope is most linear, and which that wouldn't be that part. So it's not the pure mathematical version you're looking at here. Okay. So the higher the slope is, the more unstable you are. And then I miss a slide here. Okay. So the good thing is that for this measure, it has been, so theoretically it makes some sense, although I said it seems very far off from what you're actually measuring, right? But if you look at a model, how do you choose your range for certain? I think I just answered that question. So you use from 0 to half. Okay, I did. Okay. So if you look at a model, this works as well. So this does not only work in theory, where you say, okay, should this work? Well, it does. This also works for the simple model, and I was really surprised when I found this out. It also works when we had subjects and we gave them galvanic vestibular stimulation. They also showed to be more unstable. It also worked in another study where they had subjects walk on a soft surface. We also showed larger Lyapunov exponents when walking on a soft surface. And it's been found in elderly that it's increased. So in the study I just mentioned by Kim van Schoten and Sietse Rispens, this measure also popped up as one of the measures that's correlated to falling. So then some things about measuring and calculating these Lyapunov exponents that I think are important. It's important that you use the same number of strides for all conditions tested, and the number of strides is relatively large that you need. Below here you see a figure that shows you what happens if I increase the number of strides in my analysis to the mean of my Lyapunov exponent, which I calculate. And as you can see, if you include more strides, you get higher Lyapunov exponents. So if I will compare a group of elderly to a group of young people, but for the young people they walk longer, so they have more strides, then I'm going to find that they are less stable, even though maybe they are not, but they only are because I used more strides in my analysis. Also, as you can see from the figure on the right here, is that the standard deviation is quite large if you're using short epochs. So you need quite large epochs of data in the order of, we would say, 150 strides to get reliable estimates. So the advantage is that you can calculate this measure from inertial sensor data. So you can use a simple sensor, but there's still some issues on selecting the proper state space, which I won't go into right now. So the minimum number of strides is, from this paper we said, and I don't have the reference at hand now, I can look it up quickly, is 150 strides. What we've also done more recently is to use shorter epochs, multiple shorter epochs. And that seems to work as well. Of course, the number of strides also depends on what's your goal. If you want to show differences between groups and you're going to show differences that are really large, then you can do with less strides probably, because then the variability between your conditions or between your groups is going to be larger than variability because of bad estimation of your measures, imprecise estimation of your measures. So talking about validity, theoretically yes, in simple models yes, as I already told, but only for the short term Lyapunov exponents. In experimental studies yes, but only for the short term slope, and in actual follow yes, but only for the short term slope. So it seems that this measure is a valid measure that can be used, but I would use only the short term slope, so to say. Well, before we switch over to the next measure, are there any questions? No, thanks. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to continue. If you have questions on the Lyapunov exponent, we can do that later on as well. So the next measure I want to discuss is a measure described by Althoff. It's the extrapolated center of mass, and I lied a tiny bit when I said that you need perturbations to assess stability. For your extrapolated center of mass, you actually don't need perturbations, and it will tell you how close a person is to falling over. But it will, of course, not give you the person's reactions to small perturbations or large perturbations. So it's a kind of a different measure, but I think it's a very promising measure also. So that's why I wanted to go into it. So I think most of you are familiar with this model of standing, where we regard standing as a simple inverted pendulum, for which you have a base of support and a mass which is supposed to be within the base of support, ideally a center of pressure intersecting with the center of pressure, and then you're stable. Well, this is of course not the whole story. Demo of me instead of moving. Because it can very well be that your center of mass is not in front of, not right on top of your center of pressure. And I'll try to do a demo as I have written here, instead of having a movie. I hope this works well. Let's just see. Okay, so I'm going to balance the ski pole. I think I have to take off my my headphones. So I have a ski pole here, and I'm going to balance this, okay, on my fingers, you see. And what you can notice is that it's very stable, and I can even do perturbations like this. And it's all okay as long as when the tip of the ski pole, when it's not above my finger, it should be the case that the velocity of the ski pole should be aimed towards my finger, right? Because if the ski pole is like this, it's stable, but if the position of the ski pole is there, it's going to fall over that way, unless the velocity of the ski pole is already in that direction, right? Then it will return to there. So with the extrapolated center of mass, you take into account the velocity of your center of mass as well. So you not only look at the position of your center of mass with respect to your base of support, but you take into account the velocity as well. Okay. And then you can look at the distances between your extrapolated center of mass and the feet, and see how large those are. And what you find for medial lateral direction is that your extrapolated center of mass is always between your feet, which otherwise it would mean you'd have to make a step sideways. But if you look in the anterior-posterior direction, you'll see that your extrapolated center of mass is actually in front of your feet, which means that you're falling and you need to take another step. And that's actually what we're doing when we're walking, right? We take another step each time, basically falling forward. So in this way, this measure can tell you something about how close are you to falling over, or how close are you to needing to make a reactive response for the medial lateral direction if your extrapolated center of mass during a step falls at the edge of your feet. So let's say this is well, my webcam is here. So this is my feet, and my extrapolated center of mass is here. This is the outside of my feet. My extrapolated center of mass is here. Then I have all this room to move it to. So then I'm quite safe. Say the outside of my foot is here, and it's here. Then if it's here, then I cannot keep walking like that because I will fall over that way. So then I need to take the other step there. Yeah? Okay. So it's a nice measure that tells you how close you are to falling over. But to calculate it, you need some more stuff than you need for Lyapunov exponent. So for the Lyapunov exponent, we had enough with just a simple inertial sensor. For the extrapolated center of mass, you need full body kinematics to calculate the center of mass. Although you could also calculate the center of mass by filtering and integrating your center of pressure data. In the medial lateral direction, I think that the meaning of the extrapolated center of mass is quite clear. As I said, it's basically how close are you to falling over. In the anterior posterior direction, I think it's harder to say what it actually is telling us because we're falling over all the time. So how should we look at that? It's not quite clear. So then switching to the validity, theoretically, yes, it makes sense to look at this. In simple models, yes. Adolf showed that you can make such a model, a pendulum walker, and control it even by using this extrapolated center of mass concept. And there are several other robots that use similar measures to control where they place their feet. So yes, it should work. In experimental studies, it's kind of funny because what you basically see often is that the distance between the feet and the extrapolated center of mass doesn't change so much. Or what you see is that people tend to become more stable if you look at the extrapolated center of mass because they start walking wider. So you could see this as a sign of adaptation to the instability. Also, because it's not looking at how you react to perturbations, this could very well be that you have a higher Lyapunov exponent, so you're reacting less well to perturbations. But to kind of overcome that problem, you make your basal support wider, and you have a larger distance between the extrapolated center of mass and your feet. So unluckily there's no studies in actual fallers yet, no such large studies. That's also because this would be quite hard to do. It's simply too much work to put somebody full of markers, etc. Okay. Moving on to the next measure, I'm just going to quickly ask if there's some more questions. Seems very silent. Does everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay, good. So we're going to continue then to the last measure which I want to tell you about, which is a measure which you can use for perturbed gait. So this is actually giving subjects perturbation. So gait sensitivity norm. This is a measure that was designed to test the stability of robots. It was designed by Daan Hobbelen and Martijn Wisse in Delft. And they had some stability measures in robots, but they found that they didn't work. So they were looking for something more simple, although if you look at the papers, not really. But no, in any case, they were looking for something that could say something about whether the robot was going to fall or not. And the basic idea was, okay, we perturb the gait pattern, and we see how perturbed we are and for how long we are perturbed. So what you see here is that you have an input perturbation at one step, it's this one, and then you look at the gait pattern, for instance, the step length or the step time, and you see, okay, how different is it from normal, where normal is the x-axis, that would be normal, and then this first step is of course similar because that's when the perturbation happens, and then the first step after the perturbation is shorter, then it's longer, almost similar, shorter, etc. So you look at this and you say, okay, how much is my gait pattern perturbed by a perturbation? The smart thing you do is you divide the amount that you are perturbed by the size of your perturbation, and it's basically this formula here. So you divide by E0 your difference between GK, which is gait indicator at step Y, minus G star, which is the gait indicator which you'd have if you're walking normally. So normal step time, this be for instance, and then here this would be step time when you're perturbed. And the indicators Y here just indicate that it's a different, so for instance you can use step time and step length and step width all in the same formula. Mostly we don't, so then you're just dealing with this K here, which is an indicator of the steps. So it basically says, going back to the previous slides, okay, we divide this reaction over the size of that perturbation. Right? So then you of course should come up with the question, okay, what gait indicator should I use? Because should I look at step length or step time? How do I do that? This is a question, we don't know that yet, we're looking into it. Because this measure has so far only been used for robotic gait and not for human gait. I have a student working on it now. Then normalization to baseline variance is something that is the problem with humans. This is this data is from a robot. Switching back and forth between slides here. If you look at a robot, their G star, so the gait indicator during unperturbed gait, will be constant. There will be no variation. But if I look at a human, this line here, right, the x-axis, will basically not be a line, but it will already look something like this, where every step is different. So in some way we probably need to normalize for that, and we were working on ways to do that. And the downside of this method so far is that we only calculate it at discrete time points. So you only calculate it during heel strikes, you calculate step time, but maybe it would be better to have also information between the heel strikes, and the gait sensitivity norm doesn't allow you to do that. You have only discrete, only at heel strike you know what's going on. So we're also looking into to do it continuous, and it's basically the same picture as you saw before. This should be a movie. Okay, there you go. So this is the medial lateral. This is velocities from a marker on the back. And if you run the movie, what you'll see is a red trace which traces this, and then all of a sudden jumps away. And this is basically the perturbation. And what we can do is to measure the distance from that perturbation, from that perturbed signal to the blue signal, and see how far do we get perturbed, how quick do we return to the normal pattern, etc., etc. So if we go to, has everybody seen the movie? Yes. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, there's another movie, and that shows you how this looks like if you plot on the top axis So in the movie that should be here, the distance, and here you can see the perturbation happening to a stick figure. And you see that there's an increase in the distance between what the normal walking pattern would look like and what the perturbed walking pattern looks like, and that distance slowly decreases and returns to the normal gait pattern. I'll give you all some time to look at that movie. If you've seen the movie, can please type something, then I know when I can continue. Okay, here we go. So this we can do, and we can calculate several measures from it, as outlined here. So we can calculate, for instance, I outline the most important measures. So the maximum distance from the attractor that you get after your perturbation. So how far do you move away from your normal gait pattern? And you can calculate, you can fit a return line through that via an exponential, which is mentioned there. And that will give you an idea of how fast are you returning to the gait pattern. And then you can also look at things such as the distance at the first heel strike. So how far are you recovered after one heel strike, right? And the relaxation distance, how close do you get to the normal gait pattern? Okay, so you can calculate all those parameters. Unfortunately, theoretically, this should say something. In simple models, this does say something. This is a study by Hobla and Wisse. In experimental studies, I'm working on it, and if you're in the lab, I'd be happy to give you a lab tour and show you the experiment. You can actually be a subject if you're around in Amsterdam. And in actual follows, there's no studies yet, and this is one of the reasons is, of course, that for this measure you need dedicated perturbation equipment, which not a lot of people have, and it would be hard to get a lot of people to your lab, etc. We're now working, I have a PhD student now, Michiel Punt, and he's working on testing this in stroke patients. So he will look in stroke patients at their stability, and he will look at Lyapunov exponents and also reactions to perturbations. Okay. And that was already my fourth goal, I hope. I hope to have told you something in my fourth goal about different stability measures and what the advantages and disadvantages are. And now I'm standing here as a goalie to kind of catch all your questions. So, shoot. It's a Dutch goalie, by the way. And if there is a Brazilian goal, you won't pass. Sorry. Yeah, feel free to send any questions. I still have plenty of time to answer them. So. Can I share the PowerPoint slide file? Yeah, sure. I think, Philippe, you already have it, right? Can you make sure that everybody gets it or put it online somewhere?
Yeah, I have it. I will advertise in our website, and I can put a link to download the slides. we also are recording this class, this lecture, so we'll
Okay.
put it online in a few days.
Okay.
Questions are coming.
Yes, I see. So could I comment briefly on whether or not to use local stability and orbital stability measurements? So local stability I talked about because those are Lyapunov exponents, and I would highly recommend you to use those. I think those are one of the best measurements of steady-state gait stability that are out there at the moment. Orbital stability is different. If you look at orbital stability, theoretically, yes, it should work. There's no doubt about it. It should maybe even work better than local stability Lyapunov exponents. If you look at the people in the robotics community, they hate it because it doesn't work. It will only tell them if their robot is going to fall down or not. So it will not tell them how stable is the robot, how large perturbations can it handle, etc. So if you make the simple model case, even for the simple model, not the complex robots, it does not work. It tells you nothing. If you look at the evidence at the experimental level, there is several studies that show that Fouquet multipliers, orbital stability show effects of experimental manipulations. However, the effects are almost always in the direction opposite from expected. So I would say orbital stability is basically no. It doesn't work. So for my own work, I'm not using it anymore. I basically stopped calculating it. I mean, it's not hard for me to calculate it because it's just adding one line in the script. But I don't even add that one line in the script anymore because I don't believe it works. Maybe I'm not saying that this is the final truth, of course. So maybe in 1 or 2 years or maybe a week, somebody shows up that convinces me that I'm so wrong. But for now, this is what I think, and this is what the evidence, if you look at the evidence out there, this is what it tells you. Okay, do you think it's possible to study stability with strides that are not continuous? It depends on how much strides you have. If you have walks from somebody and they're walking 10 meters back and forth, then you probably have 5 strides. You could do Lyapunov exponents and variability measures on that, but they would be of a very low statistical precision. What you could do to improve statistical precision would be to use several walks back and forth. If you don't have 5 strides, but say you have only 1 stride, only a hit of the force plate, you can of course not do those measures, but what you could do of course is, if you have enough markers to have some proxy of the center of mass, is to look at the extrapolated center of mass. Because for that, basically, you can calculate it for every stride. So you don't need multiple strides for that. Ooh, this is a hard one. Wait. I'm first gonna go to... Okay. I'm first going to go to Paula's question here. Would you define gait stability in toddlers as of reactive? Now the question is halfway gone. Reactive kind, even if they're internally perturbed, if I can say so. I would say that like the 4 different kinds of gait stability I mentioned, they are actually, it's artificial. It's a kind of an artificial separation. So you need to keep that in mind. So I don't think you can say somebody is only reactive or only steady state. I think it's a kind of a division which I tend to make things easier and to better understand it. So in toddlers, I think they have reactive gait stability and also steady state gait stability. I think their steady state gait stability will be very low, so that maybe when you're not perturbing them, you will see a lot of responses from what I would say the reactive gait stability system. Does it kind of answer your question? Thanks, yes. Okay, good. If I have several strides but do not have the same number of data points for each stride, does that affect my Lyapunov exponent validity? I think that the most important thing is that you have the same amount of strides for subjects and conditions. If you have different amounts of strides, that will definitely affect your calculations. If you have different amount of data points per average stride, because per stride they can be different, it doesn't matter. But if the average amount of data points is different, so say one subject has a stride time of 1.2 seconds and the other of 2.4 seconds, what you can do is to resample your data so that an X amount of stride has an X times 100 amount of data points. So you do the resampling of the data.
Okay, so do you have any further questions? Well, while people is...
I see one more coming up, I think.
So what? During this meanwhile, thank you very much, Sjoerd, for your time, for the great talk. I remember when we met the first time, you said at some point that you love to teach, and that's true because you give a great talk. It's very nice to follow, easy to follow, and I know there is people from very different places, not only Brazil but also in the whole world. So thank you very much, and
you're welcome.
there's two questions here, so you can...
Yes, I see.
Okay, so...
Yep, I will take a shot at answering those. Take the stable ball in a well oscillating back and forth. A perturbation will cause it to oscillate with a new amplitude and does not return to the same steady state. How is this called stable if it doesn't return to the same steady state? That's a very good question. I think this would be critical stability in a purely mathematical term. What would it look like if you had a similar thing and you calculated, for instance, your Lyapunov exponents? I think that I actually don't know what it would look like, and I don't. How is this called stable if this returns? So yeah, I think my answer to this question is it is not called stable in a way. If it's oscillating by itself as well, but then you have some forcing. So then that's again not the whole system. Then the ball and the well are not the whole system. And what about estimating tractors using the Hilbert transform? I haven't tried it, and what would you want to use the Hilbert transform for actually? I haven't read about it. Trying to see. Okay, Greg and Marcus, is your question answered in any satisfiable way, or? Okay, well, okay, several people type. I'm just going to Matthäus's question real quick. Visual presentations, so I've got 2 questions. Am I wrong to use this measure? No, I don't think so. I think it's an interesting measure. And I think you can always use other measures as well. And 2, getting all my kinematic data marker at all body, can I work with the other stability measures? Yes, of course you can. If you can calculate the center of mass, you can do Reactive exponents or variability measures on the center of mass, so that should be no problem. Okay. Then Joel, hi, what do you think about using RMS of the acceleration as the heel strike moment as a measure of gait stability? And what about smoothness of gait? Is it possible to estimate fallers from this measure? Thanks. The RMS at acceleration at heel strike, I wouldn't know, because I would first need to hear some good explanation as why it would be related to gait stability, and then I'd actually like to see something of a model and something that in experiments you can show that this works. I know, and similar for the smoothness of gait, I know that in several studies it has been shown that this correlates to falling. But then again, my argument would be, we don't know if this really is gait stability, because it may be correlated to falling, but in a different way. For instance, like I said, several things can be correlated, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they measure. It depends also on your goal. If you really want to know gait stability, I think you should go through this rigorous protocol of knowing what your measure is, making sure that it works in a model, making sure that it works in experimental cases, and seeing that it works in a large cohort. If you're just interested in predicting who's going to fall, well, I actually wouldn't stop you from using any kind of exotic measure that you can find, as long as you're going to find a very good prediction model, right? Because then you just want to say, okay, I want to know who's going to fall. And maybe if eye color is a very good predictor of that, right? Or, I don't know, somebody's hair length, right? If you find a one-on-one relationship between hair length and who's going to fall, well, then, yeah, why not? Then go for it and use that if you're going to use a prediction model. However, I don't think that you should say that's something about gait stability. I think you should say it's a predictor of falling, and it's something different from gait stability in that way, I would say. I hope this answers that question. If not, and then we go on to Marcus. We're starting to explore this tool, but maybe you can give some clues about this question. Which tool, Marcus? Using the Hilbert transformation for the estimating attractors. I actually never read about that. I recently ran into somebody and we talked quickly, and the idea would be to include the Hilbert phase, to have a better estimation of phase within your attractor, so that your nearest neighbors would always be more or less within the same phase. Is this what you're thinking about? Because it sounds like a good idea, but I haven't tried it yet, and I don't know of any papers out there that have done. Although, probably if you go into more the mathematics journals, there should be some out there. But if you look more at the modeling and the gait stuff, I'm not aware of any yet.
Thanks everybody for the questions, and I will now type the address to access the online lecture in a few days. Just give us some few days to organize everything. This is the website, so there is some previous lectures there if you want to watch. And before we finish, I would like to make some advertisement for her symposium. So her symposium is coming. It's next October here in Brazil. So if you want to know a little bit more, there is an option on English as well. There is some big names coming to talk, and you are more than invited. You can also send full papers. Submission is due by August 23. So feel free to send questions of everything you want about the symposium. Sure, I think we are done here. Time is running up. So thank you again. Thank you very much. I hope everybody enjoyed your talk. And I now just give you the microphone to the final words, and hope to meet you again soon.
Yep. Hope to meet you again soon. Thanks everybody for attending. If you have any more questions, you can always shoot me an email. I will just type my email address here. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. And I wish you all the best of luck with the upcoming game, because I know that most of you will be probably going to a bar right now to watch the game, and I will watch it here from behind this very same screen. So best of luck with that, and it was great talking to you. Thanks for the interesting questions, and well, hope to meet you all at some conference somewhere. Bye.